Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will analyze the case of the Paria diving disaster. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the incident, then offer my analysis. Paria Fuel Trading Company is a state-owned oil company in Trinidad and Tobago. Among its many projects, it operates an oil pipeline near Pier, which is the home of the largest oil refinery in the country. In early 2022, a construction contractor named Land and Marine Contracting Services, or LMCS, was hired to fix a leaking section of an oil pipe just below the berth number 6 platform, a few hundred yards from shore. The pipe, which was called Sea Line Riser 36, was 30 inches in diameter and ran from berth 6 60 feet down to the seafloor. Here there was a bend in the pipe, and it continued for 1,200 feet parallel to the seafloor, where there was another bend and the pipe went up to berth number 5. Essentially, the pipe made a gigantic U and connected the berth 6 and berth 5 platforms. 5 divers were assigned to the project: 57-year-old Faisal Kurban, 48-year-old Rishi Nagassar, 39-year-old Christopher Boudram, 36-year-old Kazim Ali, and 31-year-old Yusuf Henry. Over the course of a few weeks, the divers set up a hyperbaric habitat around the damaged section of the pipe 15 feet below the surface of the water. The pipe actually ran through this 8-foot wide habitat. Air was pumped into the habitat so the divers could work without having to wear their diving equipment. There was a hatch at the bottom of the habitat, which the divers would use to gain access to it. So they would dive into the water, swim under the habitat, and enter it from underneath. The divers removed the leaking section of the pipe and intended on installing a new section to complete the repair. Now moving to the timeline of the incident. On Friday, February 25, 2022, the 5 divers took a boat from shore to the berth number 6 platform. Their intent was to complete the repair on Sea Line Riser number 36. The men made their way to the habitat. This was supposed to be their final day on the project. Before the men could install the new section of the 30-inch pipe, they were required to remove 2 plugs. Right below the opening in the pipe, there was a mechanical plug. A little bit farther down the pipe, there was an inflatable plug. At 1:45 p.m., the men removed the mechanical plug from the pipe. Everything seemed to be going fine. The men left the habitat and went to lunch. At 2:15 p.m., 4 of the divers returned to the habitat, while Kazim monitored them from the surface. After the men experienced difficulty removing a nut from an air fitting on the inflatable plug, Kazim brought a wrench down to them. The dive he made to do this was captured on a camera he was wearing. Kazim can be seen grabbing the wrench from another worker on the surface of the water. He then begins his dive. It took him several seconds to get below the habitat. The pipe that was being worked on, Sea Line Riser number 36, is visible in front of him. At this point, Kazim swims up toward the hatch at the bottom of the habitat. Other divers and the opening of the 30-inch pipe can be seen as he moves through the hatch. At 2:45 p.m., the divers opened the valves to deflate the plug. As they were doing this, they were unaware that when the pipe was cleared of oil a month earlier, a pressure differential had been created due to an incorrect calculation. The pressure in the pipe was much lower than the pressure in the habitat. The seawater from outside the habitat entered through the hatch at the bottom at a rate of 54 gallons per second and started swirling around in a vortex. This continued until the pressure differential equalized. It was like the habitat had been transformed into a giant toilet bowl, and the 30-inch pipe opening was the drain. Christopher said it was like a tornado. Everything was just spinning and beating him up. All 5 men were pulled into the pipe opening feet first and sent down the pipe at a high speed. The first man pulled in was Rishi, followed by Faisal, Yusuf, Kazim, and finally Christopher. They traveled down for 60 feet to the bend in the pipe at the seafloor. At this point, they continued for hundreds of feet parallel to the seafloor. When they finally came to a stop, they were about 700 feet from the bend in the pipe, so about 760 feet from the opening. The inflatable plug was just a few feet ahead of them. All 5 men survived, but they were injured, submerged in water mixed with oil, and in total darkness. Diving equipment had been pulled into the opening along with the men. Faisal had an air tank. Being pulled into the pipe caused the men to be disoriented. They did not know which way to get back to the opening in the pipe where they had been working. Christopher, who was at the end closer to berth 6, where the opening was, believed the men needed to move feet first in order to reach the opening. That, of course, would have brought them closer to berth 5, where there was no way to get out. The other men disagreed with Christopher, believing they needed to move head first in order to get back to the berth 6 platform. Christopher decided to follow the recommendation of the other divers, who, of course, had correctly assessed the situation. All the men except for Rishi, who had been too badly injured to make the trip, started making their way headfirst through the pipe back toward the opening. As they were slowly making progress, Christopher found another air tank. Christopher and Kazim shared this tank as Yusef and Faisal shared the other. As the 4 men were moving, they reached a point where the air pocket terminated. Christopher decided to continue using one air tank to determine where the next air pocket was. Maybe it was close enough so that all the men could make it there. After swimming through the pipe for 15 feet without running into another air pocket, he realized there was no way they would all make it with only 2 tanks. Christopher returned to his fellow divers and shared the bad news. He told them to move back to an area of the pipe where there was more air. He would continue through the pipe and try to get help to rescue them. Faisal agreed with this plan. He encouraged Christopher to go because they were running out of air and they needed the rescue effort to get started. Kazim and Yusef disagreed and asked Christopher not to leave. Kazim grabbed Christopher's foot and pleaded with him not to go. In a move that was heartbreaking for Christopher, he was forced to kick Kazim's hand off his foot and continue the journey through the pipe, taking the air tank with him. Before the tank ran out of air, Christopher found another tank. Right after this, he discovered another air pocket. While he was breathing in this pocket, he could hear his fellow divers screaming in terror and agony. When Christopher reached the bend in the oil pipe, he continued swimming vertically up toward the surface and made it almost all the way to the opening. The water level was insufficient for Christopher to reach the edge of the opening and pull himself out. He grabbed the chain hoist, which had been used for plug removal and was hanging down into the pipeline. He banged it into the pipe. A diver named Ronald Ramator entered the habitat and pulled Christopher out of the pipe. Christopher said that his colleagues were still alive. He was taken to a hospital as other workers tried to devise a plan to rescue the trapped divers. Several LMCS workers came up with a rescue plan, but the Paria Fuel Trading Company would not permit them to enter the pipe. Company officials believed it was too dangerous and that none of the divers there had the experience necessary to facilitate the rescue. The company decided to put a camera into the pipe, but it only made it barely past the bend. When they tried with a second camera at 3 a.m., now on Saturday, February 26, 2022, it was not able to get past an air tank not far from the bend. The camera did not capture the trapped divers. The rescue workers were frustrated. They could hear tapping on the pipe, so they knew at least one diver was still alive. Over the next couple of days, no rescue effort was initiated. Paria Fuel continued to argue that it was too dangerous. They really didn't seem to know what to do. There was no rescue plan in place. On Monday, February 28, the bodies of Kazim, Yusef, and Faisal were recovered. Rishi's body was recovered on Thursday, March 3, 2022. In 2023, a government commission that investigated the disaster determined the evidence did not support the prosecution of any specific individual for manslaughter, but recommended that the Paria Fuel Trading Company be charged with corporate manslaughter. In September 2024, the government filed charges against 2 Paria Fuel managers and the director of LMCS, accusing them of violating the Occupational Safety and Health Act. The charges include failure to properly assess risks and failure to prepare and revise an emergency plan. At the time I'm making this video, the families of the divers who were killed, as well as the sole survivor, Christopher, have not received any compensation. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts on a few areas that stood out to me in this case. Item number 1. Christopher's story of survival is simultaneously incredible and terrifying. After initially being pulled into the pipe, he did not really understand what happened. Christopher wasn't even sure that he was in the pipe. He believed that he may have been in hell. To be fair, he wasn't too far off. Christopher and the other divers were trapped in complete darkness in a 30-inch pipe filled with oily water. They were forced to push their heads up as close as they could to the top of the pipe in order to breathe. They only had one air tank until Christopher found another one. Christopher became confused about what direction to move to get to safety and initially believed they needed to move feet first to reach the opening. Fortunately, he maintained flexible thinking and changed his mind after the other divers indicated they needed to move head first to the pipe opening, not feet first. The other divers, who ultimately perished, saved Christopher's life by delivering the correct assessment of their situation. After Christopher moved ahead and realized the men would not make it with the air supply they had, he could have simply abandoned them and continued to the opening. Instead, he returned to the men and explained the situation. When Christopher set off for the last time, he was forced to kick his friend's hand off his foot. As if this wasn't horrible enough, when he made it to the next air pocket, he heard the screams of his colleagues. All 4 men would suffer a particularly gruesome fate. The men survived for quite some time, hoping for a rescue that never came. An autopsy revealed that Kazim may have lived for up to 39 hours trapped in that pipe. Item number 2, Paria Fuel Trading Company claimed they had no legal responsibility to rescue the divers. They had no rescue plan. Evidently, the company was just hoping that nothing would ever go wrong. A commission investigated the incident and found a lot of problems that caused or contributed to the disaster. Just to name a few, no one was monitoring the habitat. When the men were pulled down the pipe, no one on the surface knew what happened. It wasn't until Christopher made it near the pipe opening that people found out. There was no need to have 5 divers in the chamber at one time. This risked more lives than was necessary. Safe diving practices were not followed. There was no safety plan. There was no rescue plan. There was no qualified dive supervisor. And of course, the pressure should have been equalized before removing the plugs. The report produced by the commission was 520 pages. I have read many reports during my years researching topics for videos. This may have been the worst written report I have ever seen. It was so poorly constructed, it almost drew attention away from the disastrous incident, which was the focus of the investigation. A lot of the language was vague, aimless, and gave no indication that the authors had a firm understanding of what actually happened. It was as if they set out to write a literary disaster that could rival the actual disaster. If the Paria Fuel Trading Company approached safety with the same laziness and indifference as the commission, it's no wonder this disaster occurred. There is no doubt in my mind that the company was responsible for this tragedy. It would have been relatively easy to avoid the entire incident by following standard diving safety practices. Item number 3, Christopher survived the incident, but he paid a terrible price, which includes suffering from nightmares and flashbacks. He has received some mental health counseling, but has had difficulty paying for sessions because he has been unable to return to work. Christopher is racked by guilt. He said, quote, "I made promises that I eventually couldn't keep, and that is something that I can't let go of. I just replay this in my mind. How? What could I have done different so these people could have their loved ones with them? For only me to live? What gives me that right to live?" Unquote. Survivor's guilt is pretty common after disasters like this. It often involves several symptoms, including nightmares, flashbacks, panic attacks, depression, grief, hopelessness, isolation, and an overwhelming sense of shame. Survivors often ask themselves why they made it when others didn't, and wonder if their survival was some type of mistake, as if they should not actually be alive. This kind of guilt is common even when the survivor had no chance of helping those who died. It is often worse if the survivor had some reason to believe they could have offered assistance, but failed to do so. In the case of the pipeline disaster, Christopher may have believed that he let his colleagues down. In reality, it was the company that failed them by not preventing the incident and by failing to launch a rescue mission. Christopher was actually a hero who did everything he could to save the lives of the other divers. Now moving to my final thoughts. I have covered myriad topics involving gruesome deaths, but there is something uniquely horrifying about deaths that occurred in confined spaces. The Paria Fuel diving incident is one of the most terrifying scenarios imaginable. People trapped in total darkness in a pipe with barely enough room to move, submerged in oily water, wondering if anyone will ever come to help them. The men were not even sure that anyone knew they were missing. This tragedy underscores the importance of providing mental health care to survivors of such disasters. Physically escaping may seem like a complete victory, but for some, part of them remains trapped in the darkness, surrounded by screams that will never quite fade. Those are my thoughts on the Paria diving disaster. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.